Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
The long hospital corridors seemed almost endless. The girl, sitting on the long bench, was looking around, completely lost in her own thoughts. It seemed like even if she saw someone here, she wouldn't recognize them. The lamps hanging from the ceiling barely produced any light. Mockingly, they flickered, casting a dim glow, reminiscent of the despair lurking within these walls. Adriana Sans. The doctor uttered monotonously, and the girl stood up. She walked towards the office. Her every step echoed down the long corridor. The rustling of shoe covers and the smell of medicines all merged in the quiet corridor. She felt nauseous from the constant anxiety, as if a bell were ringing in her head. She knew what the doctor would tell her because she had seen it in her dreams. Adriana was not one to believe in superstitions, but in a situation where everyone seemed to shrug their shoulders, you could believe anything. The old doctor settled into his chair, furrowed his brows, and looked at her as if she had already done something wrong by coming into his office. This man had a gift for making people feel guilty with just a glance. Adriana, I won't drag this out too long. Ultimately, it's futile. I've received all the tests. You are infertile. You won't be able to have children, the man said, then sighed softly. He handed her a sheet of paper. Adriana didn't say anything to him, just looked at the sheet where her fate was written. The doctor's words sounded like a verdict. Adriana silently stood up, left the office. The doctor didn't try to stop her. He had diagnosed such cases before, so he didn't bother consoling the unfortunate women who lost the meaning of life in a single moment. Adriana couldn't remember how she got home. The words of the doctor, her own thoughts, and some endless stream of consciousness all jumbled in her head. Why hadn't she been examined earlier? Why did another hospital hold promises? Adriana shook her head negatively, sank into a deep, high-backed armchair, covered her face with her hands, and cried. She had undergone all these tests even before breaking up with her future husband. He came home and said it was over between them, that he had found the love of his life. And now her fiancé was gone, and a few days later, she received dismal results. All her conscious life, Adriana dreamed of becoming a mother. And what would she do now? There was no desire to do anything else. The girl, whom her fiancé was probably with, didn't have such problems. Surely, she would give him a healthy son or daughter, and they would build a happy family. But what would Adriana do? What man would need her when he found out she was incapable of producing an heir? Adriana once again burst into tears. She was laying like that until morning, drifting in and out of sleep, her cheeks stained with tear streaks. The next day, she rose to the alarm clock. Today was a significant day. She changed her workplace and was now about to start working in a new branch. Frankly, she didn't want to go to work in such a state. She needed to see the doctor on a different day, but Adriana didn't even suspect what she would hear. She got ready and pulled herself together. She headed to the new office where she was going to work. In her mind, she kept repeating that it wasn't the end of the world. People lived with worse diagnoses, so she would cope with her ailments. When Adriana entered the room, the HR specialist immediately took her by the arm and led her to another room. She began to explain where her workplace was, outlining her duties. Adriana had been in the field for too long, so it wasn't news to her what exactly she was supposed to do. The branch manager, Valerio Castro, turned out to be a pleasant young man. He noticed the newcomer right away, and within minutes he was standing by her desk, chuckling and giving mischievous advice. He looked good-natured, trustworthy, and dependable. But Adriana's breakup was too painful for her to start new relationships right now. Don't moan over him, chances are slim, a colleague said, waving her hand. What do you mean? Adriana asked. There's nothing to catch there, honey. Nothing belongs to this guy here. His uncle inherited everything, and he adores his nephew, so he entrusted him with management. The guy is great, of course, he's managing things well. He considers employees' opinions and boosts profits, but he still remains just a right-hand man, the colleague said. I paid attention to him at first too, but he's too young. And if the uncle says so, he'll be left with empty pockets. So what? If he's broke, should I not pay him any attention? The girl smirked, surprised at how mercenary her colleague was. Adriana and Nora used to communicate when they worked in the same office, but Nora transferred here earlier, and their communication practically dwindled to zero. Why else do we need a man? So that I can serve him for free while he's picking his nose at home? No, thank you. Either both work and manage household chores, or let him work properly and earn if he wants a free servant at home. Just like his father. He's a man of age, and he found himself a young wife. She caters to him, and he provides for her. They have no children of their own, but look, he adores his nephew. Although, who knows, anyone can end up in such a family. Nora laughed and went to her desk. Adriana never considered the young guy as a potential romantic partner. First and foremost, she came here to work, although she found the young man very appealing. Adriana had been working in the new office for several days already. She couldn't get used to the frantic pace that prevailed here. She couldn't figure out how to manage everything, but she tried to get closer to the ideal result. Soon, she was no worse than the others. Adriana, your performance is excellent, the man said with a smile, approaching her desk. Valerio was in a good mood today. More like playful. He laughed with the employees, assigned quite serious tasks, and encouraged them. He definitely knew his business. Working under such a person could be enjoyable, despite the serious workload. Don't you want to go on a date with me? Valerio asked, leaning over the desk. No, I don't engage in office romances, Adriana said. He laughed, muttered a joke, and she laughed too. The office staff couldn't help but notice that there were feelings between them. But Adriana herself didn't want to turn all this into something more significant yet. Adriana was going home. The bus was completely full. She looked out the window and couldn't believe how much her life had changed in the past few weeks. She was already getting used to the idea that she wouldn't have children. And it seemed quite realistic that there would be someone who also didn't particularly need them. At work, she consulted with several colleagues, and for the vast majority, it wasn't a problem at all. But she still had the guilty feeling inside her, and she continued to call herself defective, not a real woman, somehow wrong. The main thing was that the anxiety in her chest was gradually subsiding. The next day was the long-awaited day off, and Adriana was supposed to meet with her friend. She was in a good mood from the early morning. Bad dreams no longer haunted her, but instead, a strange premonition of something good appeared. She enjoyed her work, and flirting with the boss was also quite pleasant. She didn't delve into the details of what he saw in her. Adriana treated this flirting quite superficially. He never mentioned anything about serious relationships and joked about having a date. It hardly seemed worth it to have any serious plans in her head regarding such an unserious person. Adriana pushed away any thoughts that all these signs might be something serious. It was not the time for serious relationships. Adriana dashed out of the house, buttoned her coat tighter not to let the icy wind penetrate her thin sweater. She walked a few meters, jumped on the bus, and now waited for it to take her to the center, where a small but cozy cafe was located. When Adriana finally got off the bus, she hurriedly headed towards the coffee shop. As soon as she entered and took off her coat, she immediately saw her friend. Isabel waved at her, then got distracted again by the waiter, explaining what they would eat and drink. Come on, tell me. How's the new job? Isabel asked, smiling mischievously. They say you have a young boss there, the owner's nephew? The one who keeps inviting me on dates, Adriana said, then laughed to make the phrase not sound too serious. Oh, come on. I've seen him a few times. He's not the type to chase girls using his position. Are you sure it's not serious? He seems like a decent guy. And after your ex, he's practically an angel, Isabel said, rolling her eyes. A slender waitress approached, placed a tray on the table, and set out everything that was ordered. She said something and then left them alone. Of course, it's not serious, Adriana waved off, not even intending to dwell on the topic. We're just joking around, that's all. Overall, I'm satisfied with everything in the office. I do miss the old company, of course, but that was the best decision for my career. Isabel nodded, and they changed the topic of their conversation. Now they were talking about Adriana's work, leisurely discussing plans for the near future. They simply enjoyed the pleasant, cozy atmosphere, not rushing each other with conclusions. Both girls loved meeting up at cafes, spending time, and chatting heart to heart. And they didn't worry about what others might think. They never judged each other, and that was the main advantage of their friendship. Adriana spent the whole morning getting ready. She was almost late, realizing for the first time in her life that she had overslept. The alarm clock rang, as always, and she turned it off with a single movement of her hand. The girl forgot that she hadn't set another alarm. When she opened her eyes, it was already time to rush out of the house in literally 10 minutes. Adriana hurriedly got ready, constantly glancing at the clock. She managed to catch the minibus just as it was pulling away from the stop. And finally, she was sitting inside, relieved that she wouldn't be late for work. It wasn't worth framing her colleagues, especially in the first month of work. But when Adriana entered, she saw a strange girl, a young beauty who seemed to look like a model on a magazine cover. They could have taken a perfect photo of her for some plastic surgery clinic. When she smiled, not a single muscle on her face seemed to move properly. The girl, with her nose in the air, was scrutinizing all the employees. She constantly made unpleasant comments, which everyone ignored. Adriana immediately understood that such a phenomenon was not rare here. Apparently, everyone had simply gotten used to it and didn't exacerbate the conflict. "Here's our so-called beauty that Valerio has his eye on," Lucretia said, then chuckled unpleasantly. "Well, I don't know. I wouldn't pay attention to someone like that." She snorted, turned away from Adriana, and then accosted another employee, explaining that their performance was worse than the others. No one knew where she got any information about performance indicators. Everyone looked at Lucretia as if she were an empty space. But no one even uttered a word to stand up for themselves. Adriana understood that it was pointless. Moreover, everyone wanted to keep her job. Apparently, the owner of the company allowed his girl to have such fun and then compensated the employees with bonuses. "Dears, I'm leaving. Don't worry, when I start managing the company, you'll have real fun. You're living well now, but later I'll show you what it means to work for real," the girl said arrogantly and then left. She probably doesn't even know what real work is. The girl at the reception said, and everyone started laughing immediately. Adriana later found out that such a situation was a usual one. Lucretia occasionally came to the office, pretended to be in charge, and then disappeared as if she were never there. Valerio arrived at the office a few minutes later. He looked busy and serious. But as soon as he entered the office, he immediately put on his usual smile. "Did Lucretia come by? Did she tell you how to work well?" Valerio smirked. He immediately heard complaints, but they were all superficial. Rather, even playful. No one took this young woman seriously, so all her instructions and sharp remarks were like a child's babbling to the rest of the employees. "Well, it happens. The child needs to entertain herself somehow," Valerio said, then smirked somewhat grimly. Adriana remained seated at her desk. She worked and thought only about how she probably didn't stand a chance with such a man. He was tall, handsome, and clearly well off. He knew what he wanted from life and didn't demand anything from others. It was rare to find such a person, and most likely, he would choose a girl who suited him. Adriana wasn't particularly upset about it. She already had other plans for her life, not connected with relationships. The day she spent at the doctor's had a significant impact on her. He invited her on another date, and she almost agreed, but she got distracted. He promised to come back, but he never returned to her desk. Some problems started. Everyone around was running around, tiredly trying to improve their performance before submitting reports. Finally, Basilio Gil himself, the owner of the company, arrived. But there was no joy on his face after this trip. He was a stern man. He could put any employee in their place without hesitation, but he never scolded anyone without reason. However, his strong character had been a reason for dismissal more than once. Adriana had heard about it. Basilio didn't care much for his nephew, but at the same time, he didn't let him off easy on work matters. Adriana knew that the young man probably had a hard time with such a parent. But still, it was better than working in some factory with no chance of promotion. Adriana went home, still not having heard from the young boss who promised to invite her on a date. It was all just jokes, and she tried not to take it seriously anymore. But somewhere deep down, she knew he had touched the delicate strings of her soul. The sharp knock on the door woke Adriana up. She sat up in bed, looked around bewilderedly, and strained to understand where the sound was coming from. When Adriana realized that someone was knocking on the door, she went to the corridor. Looking through the peephole, Adriana saw her friend, who startled her with utterly frantic eyes. As soon as the girl opened the door, Isabel burst in. "Have you gone mad or something? Why aren't you answering your phone? My goodness, I thought something had happened to you. Do you even watch the news? There's a citywide lockdown. My entire neighborhood is cordoned off. I managed to get out in time," Isabel exclaimed, panting heavily. She was heavily out of breath from rushing here, and now she was struggling to catch it. Adriana turned on the television. Immediately, a flood of news poured over her. She was watching as the correspondent reported and showed that a whole part of the city was cordoned off, and none of the employees were willing to disclose what was happening. The office where Adriana worked was exactly in the sealed-off area. She didn't like it at all. She made the bed on the couch for her friend, but they couldn't manage to fall asleep. "What do you think? Is it a terrorist attack or something? When my neighbor called and told me, I immediately started calling you, but you weren't answering. I nearly lost my mind. I rushed straight to you, hoping that you were okay. You know that besides you, I have no one in this city. I already called Alex. He's also very worried." Alex was Isabel's fiancé, but they were temporarily living in different countries. Most of all, Adriana was afraid that Alex would take her friend away. Take her abroad, and there they would build their lives far from Adriana. They were sitting in front of the television, watching attentively. Both tried to understand what was happening there. Isabel anxiously glanced at her phone, as she also couldn't reach another acquaintance who happened to live in that area. But soon the report stopped, and apparently, the press was banned from showing what was happening. The girls fell asleep only at dawn, and when they woke up, it was all over. Once again, all parts of the city were open. People continued to live on as if nothing had happened. Isabel thanked her friend for providing shelter. She went back to her place while she still had the chance. They agreed that Isabel could return at any time if the situation in her area remained unstable. Adriana went to work, suspecting that the office might be closed. But no one warned her, so everything should have proceeded as usual. However, when Adriana entered the office, she was simply stunned by what she saw. Everyone was running around like they had been stung, trying not to lose their minds. Some were running with papers, and some were talking on the phone. Someone was yelling into the phone so loudly that the noise echoed throughout the floor. Adriana felt like she had missed something important in the office and still didn't understand what was happening. "Nora, what's going on? A citywide lockdown happened last night, and now this nightmare," Adriana exclaimed, barely catching her friend in the midst of all this chaos. "My God, I don't even know myself. I arrived, and everyone says the boss is missing. But they found out something, and now everyone's looking for him. The whole city is going crazy. I don't understand how we're going to work now and how this will affect all of us," Nora said, almost in tears. She looked around, but then she was ordered to prepare papers with contracts for June. Meanwhile, Adriana was called into the boss's office. Adriana was sitting on the couch, her head lowered, waiting for the boss. A heavy man with a stern face, displaying character, entered the office. He frowned, took a chair, and sat down opposite her so close that she felt uncomfortably uneasy. So, let's talk normally now, okay? Let's say I'll react calmly if you tell me the truth. Even if you're involved in this, I'll cover it for you. But I need the truth. Remember, girl, I'm not someone you can easily deceive. Adriana didn't really understand what was going on at all. Therefore, all the words that the owner of the company said seemed excessively inappropriate to her. It was as if she was a stranger here and did not belong to this interrogation, which more resembled questioning at a police station. But at that moment, Adriana had no idea how much this situation could change her life. Basilio Gil sighed heavily. He looked at her, then shook his head negatively and pursed his lips. Adriana, it is not the time to play games. If you don't tell me anything right now, the situation will continue to unfold unfavorably for you. He ran away, some machinations were uncovered, and you'll have to deal with the consequences as an accomplice. What? Adriana just froze, looking at the man who was breathing heavily. It was evident that the absence of his nephew had hit the man very hard. Maybe because he was deeply disappointed. Or maybe, on the contrary, he had complete faith in his nephew. And therefore, he worried even more about this situation. He simply gestured for her to leave. Obviously, he didn't expect her to say anything more to him. Adriana left the office, still looking around strangely. The hustle and bustle around her seemed unnatural, alien to this office, where there was usually a heavy workload but no such chaos. People didn't even gossip simply because there was no time. Everyone was focused on the single opportunity to finish all the work as quickly as possible, go home, lay on the couch, and just sink into the heavy feeling of sleep. That evening, Adriana came home with heavy feet. She quickly found herself caught up in all this hustle and bustle, so she got the full experience. She decided to fry an egg because she had no energy for anything else, and then Adriana slumped into her chair. She felt like crying from exhaustion and strain. Adriana, where are you right now? Isabel asked when Adriana finally answered the phone. I just got home from work. The day was catastrophically hard. Adriana, do you know that they're accusing you of something? I have some acquaintances there. They told me about it. Do you even know what's going on? Is it somehow related to the nighttime lockdown? Adriana froze for a moment. She was listening carefully to her friend's words, but hadn't reacted to them yet. My boss called me into his office. His nephew apparently disappeared. Some schemes were uncovered, and he thinks I'm involved. But I know I'm not. So, I'm sure they'll ask me some questions, and that's it. They wouldn't put me in jail without any evidence, would they? She said with a smile and was confident in her words, unlike her friend. Isabel was deeply concerned, but Adriana didn't even intend to listen. It had been a hard day. She apologized and said she would call back later. Adriana had disturbing dreams that night. Troubling notes kept creeping in, reflected in heavy nightmares. As a result, Adriana woke up feeling completely unrest, although she had enough time to rest. Another workday with another set of tasks was waiting for her. Everything was supposed to proceed as usual. However, in the morning, when Adriana arrived at work, the police officers met her. She was very surprised. Adriana was simply thunderstruck, watching as they calmly took her and led her into another room. She was questioned, and they warned her that the situation would end badly. When Adriana was led outside and then taken to the police station, she was completely bewildered. She felt paralyzed with fear and confusion about what was happening. Adriana was placed in a strange, narrow room. She barely understood what was happening and where she was. Her head ached badly from anxiety. Adriana tried to pull herself together to think about something else. From time to time, an investigator would come, telling her that Valerio Castro had disappeared. They said that after his disappearance, some machinations were uncovered, and she would be treated as an accomplice if she didn't explain anything. They promised to help her, citing various possible sentences. And they advised her to surrender as soon as possible so she could get leniency. However, if Adriana could have made her fate easier, she would have taken advantage of that chance. But she was completely innocent. And she could hardly believe that she could be imprisoned just because this man once jokingly invited her on a date. Throughout the evening, she was tormented by various interrogations, driven to desperation, threatened, and offered various ways out of the situation. But Adriana, frightened and paralyzed by her own fear, could only watch this horrible situation unfold from the sidelines. The trial came so quickly that she herself did not expect such an outcome. She was sentenced, although everyone around her insisted it was illegal. There was no real evidence of her guilt, and there couldn't be. But the police officers simply shrugged and said that was how it usually went. Isabel was the first to visit her. She was shaking with heightened anxiety, her whole body trembled. Isabel realized that she couldn't help her friend in any way, and it made everything even worse. "I've already found a good lawyer. They'll review the case." "Don't worry, I'll get you out of here," Isabel said, with undisguised concern in her voice. Adriana just looked at her and understood that Isabel would soon leave the room and be out there, free. It was incomprehensible to her how she ended up here while life was passing by. She hadn't done anything, hadn't committed any wrongdoing in her life. And now she was in prison, without even a chance to escape from this nightmare. "Just don't lose hope, okay? I'll figure something out. We'll get you out anyway, don't worry. I still can't calm down after all this. How could they even pin all this on you?" Isabel was still outraged. "What's going on anyway? Did they talk about me on TV? Do you know any details that shed some light on this? They say I'm an accomplice, although I don't even know why. They think I'm lying, but..." Adriana was almost crying. Her eyes were filled with crystal clear tears. "And I don't even understand what my fault is. I just worked, didn't bother anyone, and didn't snoop around. And now it turns out I've been imprisoned without being guilty. My God, when you called me and told me about the case, I couldn't believe it was possible. I thought only on TV people could be imprisoned without evidence or guilt." She burst into tears, burying her head in her hands. Adriana really wanted to take her hand, hug her, and hold her close, but now they were separated by glass, and it was impossible to touch each other. Adriana was led to a cell, where her cellmate, an equally dejected, sad woman, was waiting for her. But she was here for the crime she committed. Adriana didn't ask anything extra and didn't say or tell anything. They just immersed themselves in their pain, painfully digging into every moment of the past. She wanted to find the reason. Why did she end up here? But every time Adriana delved into the past and remembered every moment, she found no reason why she should have remained behind bars. No evidence was presented in court. Everything was only based on assumptions, without any proof. When Adriana found herself in the room for visits again, she was already aware of the gravity of her situation and accepted the fact that she wouldn't be able to get out of here willingly. The same girl, who used to come to the office and set her own rules, was sitting across from her. Her smug face felt like a weight on Adriana's chest after everything she had been through in prison. She looked at the girl with tired, dull eyes as the girl continued to enjoy her freedom and even came here to taunt the unfortunate girl who ended up here purely by chance. "Why do I hear rumors that you're receiving letters from your sweetheart?" the girl asked, nervously fidgeting with her hands. Lucretia glanced at her watch, then stared intently at the girl again. "What letters? I don't receive any letters at all." "I have no idea where you heard such gossip," Lucretia replied. "Know your place, girl. I can put you in a prison that will ruin your entire life. If he's writing to you, then I need to know about it. You can just nod, I'll be informed anyway. And besides, if you tell me the truth, I'll help you get out of here. You know, for people with money, there are no boundaries," Lucretia said conspiratorially. Adriana looked into that polished, well-groomed face and realized that she wouldn't be able to prove anything to her. She hadn't planned on saying anything because there was nothing to say. "No one writes to me. You can ask anyone who's in charge of this prison. I don't receive any letters. I just read newspapers and books here, Adriana replied. Well, as you wish. I gave you a chance. Lucretia replied sharply, then left. When Adriana returned to the cell, she told her cellmate everything was as it was. The woman was listening almost silently, occasionally expressing indignation. But she clearly believed her. For the first time in a long time, Adriana saw someone other than her friend who believed her. Adriana, you just need to accept it. You won't get out of here, even if you're not guilty. You'll have to wait out your entire sentence before you're free and can get revenge on these bastards, the cellmate said, awkwardly shrugging her shoulders. It was hard for Adriana to admit, even to herself, that she would have to get stuck here. She would serve her full sentence, even though she hadn't done anything at all. Just the thought of it made her sick and scared, as life in prison wasn't good at all. And the worst part was realizing that Adriana had never hurt another person in her life, let alone committed any serious crimes. Where was the justice in this? Adriana felt tears welling up. She climbed onto her bunk and just cried, realizing not only the seriousness but also the hopelessness of her situation. 2 years flew by unnoticed. Adriana was standing by the exit, looking at the huge fence covered with barbed wire. She pondered what she would do with her useless life now. Who would hire her with such a record? Who would even consider employing someone who had served as an accomplice in a major fraud? Every time these thoughts crossed her mind, she felt a painful stab in her chest, resentment, injustice, and a desire to revenge those who had put her here. When you're released, don't do anything stupid, the female guard said, coming to the main gates. Many people, like you, think about revenge. They want to retaliate, hold burning anger in their hearts. Got me right, girl. There's no justice in this life. If you seek revenge, you'll end up back here again. Karma will come back to another person, but it's not up to us to seek justice. Adriana nodded but didn't respond to the advice. It was unlikely that the person who didn't even remotely understand her feelings could help her. Adriana sighed heavily, feeling even worse. The gates opened, and she walked out, not understanding how to live after such a difficult past. Isabel, who was waiting for her at the gates, literally jumped in surprise. She had just arrived and was planning to wait for hours, but the gates opened immediately. Isabel rushed to hug her, kissing her on both cheeks. She congratulated her on finally ending this nightmare. Isabel had come from abroad just to meet her and help for some time until her friend could get back on her own 2 feet. When Isabel calmed down a bit, she noticed right away that her friend wasn't joyful at all. She was just silently looking around. She didn't even smile. Isabel felt the pain somewhere in her chest. She felt sorry for her friend, for her broken life, and for the countless problems that had befallen the young woman. They were driving in the car in absolute silence. On both sides of the road, there was an endless plain. A light fog, swirling in wisps, was spreading in the fields. Adriana was looking out the window, watching life thrive around her. But when would her own life thrive? She just shook her head negatively. When they arrived at Adriana's small apartment, it was clean and tidy. Isabel had made an effort to make living comfortable again. She stocked the fridge with groceries and acted as if nothing had happened. But only Adriana understood that no amount of support could hide the fact of how much nightmare and humiliation she had endured there, in prison, being completely innocent. Listen, Adriana, you know, I'm only here for a short time. I came just to meet you, Isabel said. I understand, I'm not mad at you. On the contrary, I'm very grateful to you for what you've done. You supported me so much all this time, and I'm grateful to you. Adriana said, hugging her friend and feeling she was almost on the verge of tears. I just wanted to say that I'm very afraid you'll start seeking revenge. The people who put you in jail are clearly not the kind who will let vengeance go unpunished. I just want you to go on living. It may be painful and hurtful, but sometimes you need to let go. Of course, I understand that I might not be the best advisor, but I've never experienced a nightmare like you have. But I really want you to move on, Isabel said, lowering her head, taking a deep breath and trying to look serious again instead of breaking down at the first attempt to talk. I won't seek revenge on anyone. I'm absolutely not up for that. I need to somehow get my life back on track, try to find a job. After all, I need to make a living to eat something eventually, Adriana said, falling silent. Only now did her friend notice how much weight she had lost. It was as if she had withered away during all this time. Adriana took a deep breath and sat down in the chair. For some reason, there were no memories in her head, as if her mind had carefully erased all the problems and horrors she had experienced. Adriana didn't want to torture herself mentally, so she decided that nothing critical was happening. If she didn't force herself to remember the whole nightmare, maybe it would be easier for her to move on with her life. I've arranged something with the head doctor of the local hospital. It's not the greatest job, but maybe if you don't find anything else. Working as a nurse is not easy, I don't need to tell you that. But if you really can't find anything else, you can call him. I've already told him about you. The head doctor is a very difficult person, and I would be completely unhappy if you ended up working there. But sorry, I couldn't find anyone else who would agree to take you on after such a record, Isabel said, shamefully lowering her head as if she couldn't come to terms that she couldn't find a better option. But Adriana was glad even for this. At least there was some opportunity to start working again and make a living. She couldn't call it life yet. Isabel headed back to her apartment. Adriana mentally prepared herself to go to the hospital the next day. There was no point in being coy about it. She already knew that, with her record, it would probably be impossible to find a decent job. Adriana looked at herself in the mirror and realized that she had missed all the chances in her life. She had to learn to move on, despite everything. When she arrived at her new workplace, she almost immediately realized that she wasn't welcome there. The nurses looked askance at the young girl, unable to understand how she, with her appearance, could work as a nurse. "You'd better go home, girl. It's better to mop floors here than to work for such a boss," the senior nurse said, shaking her head disapprovingly. "You know what it is like with medications. Being here is the last and only option. So, I hope you'll think about it. If you think our boss is like all the other head doctors, all understanding, then you're very much mistaken." "It seems like this is my last option," Adriana said wearily, still not understanding why she was being dissuaded when she came here on her own. The senior nurse just shook her head again. But then a young girl, who had been glancing at the newcomers sideways the whole time but hadn't dared to approach, stepped forward. "Are you going to work here as a nurse? Aren't you ashamed to have such a miserable job at your age?" she asked, smirking. "Marina, get out of here. It's not miserable for her. And you're climbing the career ladder straight to being a nurse. You act like you're the boss here, don't you? What the hell are you doing?" The senior nurse cut in abruptly. She turned back to Adriana. "The team here is exactly no picnic. You could say it starts with the boss and only gets worse from there. Think about it, girl. Do you really need this kind of experience in your life?" Adriana walked down the corridor to the chief physician's office, silently waiting to be hired. She was ready to agree to any conditions, as the path back to her old job was blocked. She was sitting down, staring at her own hands, contemplating how her life would change now. But one thing Adriana promised herself firmly: no matter what happened at work, she had to endure it to save money, go back to school, find remote work, and no longer worry about bosses, difficulties, or an unpleasant team. Pablo Morales, who had hired her, was clearly delighted. Not only did he dislike her from the start, but now he also understood that she would patiently endure his pressure until he began to bully her. The chief physician came up with all sorts of silly tasks, from cleaning up after homeless people to endlessly scrubbing the floors in his office. He was an old man who, one would think, should have been wise and restrained. However, he wasn't like this at all. He taunted the young girl, constantly repeating that she had ruined her life and now had to endure all his taunts. Because otherwise, he would fire her and then not let her find a job anywhere, not even in some lousy grocery store. Adriana patiently endured the pressure, but with each passing day, it became increasingly difficult. It felt like she was in a cage with a wild beast she couldn't fight back against and had to endure for the sake of her own future well-being. Adriana descended to the first floor and inserted a few coins into the vending machine. She grabbed a cup of coffee, barely bringing it to her lips, when the chief physician immediately jumped up and shoved her so hard she almost fell backward. The cup spilled, and her entire gown was stained with coffee. "Why are you so sloppy?" the chief physician said, then laughed loudly and walked along the corridor. "Adriana, come here, I'll give you a new gown," the senior nurse said calmly, having witnessed the whole situation. "Don't worry, a couple more years and this old stump will leave on his own. We'll get a normal chief physician. That's the only thing that keeps me in this cursed place. I still don't understand why you put up with him. Of course, we all do, but he's really out of line with you." Adriana silently took another gown, thanked the woman, and then went to do her job. Tears of hurt welled up in her eyes. She used to be a respected person, calmly doing her job. But every time she saw the chief physician, fear and the understanding that the situation would only get worse clenched inside her. She had to endure a little longer to leave this job, study, and find a job at some small company working remotely. Adriana understood that she was dragging on with all these problems for too long, but there wasn't much of a way out. She didn't complain to her friend Isabel either, because she was grateful that she had given her the opportunity to work. After all, Isabel had no idea what kind of person he was or what kind of nightmare was happening inside an ordinary city hospital. "He's driving me crazy. I don't even know what to do with him anymore. Every time I come, he starts lecturing me. When will they replace him?" the young nurse said, approaching the nurse room. Adriana was standing around the corner, unseen by anyone. She was sorting through patient cards, arranging them in alphabetical order, but couldn't help but listen to the conversation. "That jerk should have been locked up long ago for his inhuman treatment of people. He treats us here like slaves, and everyone tolerates it. Look how he's making fun of the new girl. It's scary to watch. She's not a good person either. Why would she put up with all this nonsense the other way? At her age and with her appearance, she should quickly find herself a husband, have children, and stay at home. But she's messing around with nonsense. She must have deserved it." Marina exclaimed. "No one deserves that, Marina. Stop being angry at her as if she stole your husband. It wasn't her, but someone like her. Maybe she stole someone's husband too, and now fate is taking revenge on her." Adriana stepped out from behind the corner, walked past the nurses, and greeted them, but pretended she hadn't heard anything. They exchanged glances, greeted her back, but didn't ask her any questions. Adriana calmly walked away, continued to deal with her work matters. But more and more often, she pondered that perhaps it would be better to scrub floors, earn less, but save more, than to work under the management of such a tyrant. The chief called her in. Once again, she was scrubbing the floors while he was enjoying the view, as that was the only reason he summoned her. "You know, Adriana, you should be grateful to me. Someone like me is a big rarity. Most people would just leave you on the sidelines of life, but I agreed to give a job to someone like you. It's your own fault. You should have thought before getting into crime. But now you'll have to pay for it. You can consider me your chief prophet," the man said, bursting into laughter. Adriana understood that she wasn't going to do anything about it. Most of all, she wanted to take a mop, wrap it around this person's head, and wait until he begged for help. Sometimes she would lift her head and look at him, feeling disappointed both in her own life and in her job. "If it weren't for me, you'd be lounging somewhere on the streets. People like you don't deserve a normal life. And you should understand that. Of course, in your eyes, I'm some kind of monster who mistreats a poor little girl," the chief physician said, then chuckled maliciously. "But let's be honest, without me, you're nothing, and you won't get anywhere." He smiled again, looking at her as if she were a silly little fool. Adriana patiently continued scrubbing the floors, and when she finished, she only glanced at the man who continued to torment her. Pablo crossed his arms over his chest and looked at her from top to bottom. "I don't really want to discuss anything with someone like you. But here I am, talking to you. I can see perfectly well how the other nurses treat you. If it weren't for me, you would have been fired long ago," he said. Adriana remained silent again, though he drove her to the line with his foolish questions. She couldn't provoke a conflict. She quietly finished mopping the floors, tossed the rag into the bucket, and then left. Was he nagging again? Probably he told you that without him you would have been fired long ago, right? The senior nurse asked when she saw Adriana leaving the chief's office. How did you guess? Adriana exclaimed in amazement. Our chief has no brains. He says the same thing to absolutely everyone. Don't worry, if he fires you, it's fine. It's not the kind of job you need to hold on to. You'll figure things out somehow afterward. The senior nurse waved her hand dismissively. Adriana headed home. Every time she had to make the trip back, she felt like crying, realizing that nothing good was going to happen anymore. She would return to her empty apartment. Fortunately, at least there was a roof over her head. She would barely make ends meet, and maybe someday it would get easier to deal with this life. But when Adriana was approaching home, she saw Isabel there, and she didn't expect that. She was standing under her windows, already pulling out her phone to call her friend. When Isabel turned her head, she immediately let out a sigh. I was just about to call you. I thought something happened to you at work. I called you during the day. Were you busy? I brought you groceries. Actually, I need to talk to you, Isabel said. She sounded concerned and looked carefully at her friend. Adriana already understood what they would talk about. She knew her friend too well, her life aspirations, and the specifics of her current romantic relationships with Alex. They entered the apartment, and Isabel immediately began setting delicious dishes on the table, which she had ordered from the restaurant for takeout. She occasionally glanced sideways at her friend, who seemed a bit out of sorts. Adriana looked lost and miserable. She already knew what would come next, and the awareness of it made her heart ache bitterly and unbearably. Adriana was alone. She had no one left. And now, losing her only friend was the worst thing. However, Adriana understood that she couldn't hold Isabel back. It wasn't her fault that she had no one else except her. Isabel hesitated and didn't know how to start the difficult conversation. And then, after taking a deep breath, she blurted out, I'm getting married to Alex. We're moving to his country permanently. Adriana just nodded. How was she supposed to react? Fall to her knees, cry, and beg her to stay? For Isabel, this was a chance to realize herself in another country and finally live for her own pleasure rather than helping everyone in need. Adriana hugged her friend and congratulated her on the upcoming move, but there was no joy on her face. They both knew the situation was inevitable. It was only a matter of time. I've been postponing things because I wanted to have the opportunity to help you get out of nowhere. But now there's no point in waiting any longer. We're doing great, and besides, we've long agreed on this with him. I'm sorry it turned out this way, Isabel said. Isabel, you don't need to apologize. I'm really grateful to you for everything, truly. I'm actually glad that you'll finally be happy. Alex is a good guy, and you're doing great together. Plus, you've been studying the language for a long time and dreaming of moving. I truly wish you happiness, Adriana replied. They hugged and talked a bit, constantly glancing at each other, as if afraid that one of them would break down and cry. Adriana had lost the ability to cry for any reason back in prison. After everything she had been through, she could always find a memory worse than any minor inconvenience that happened. Adriana was alone in the apartment. There were various jars on the kitchen table, recently filled with restaurant food. She was staring out the window, realizing that life had ended and she couldn't fulfill her desires, even though she desperately wanted to. Adriana counted the measly pennies she had managed to save over time. She lived on the brink of starvation, sometimes not eating for days to save a little more. But it felt like the cost of the courses was mocking her. Just as she approached the required amount, prices would rise or other companies would offer more favorable deals. She knew that with her current work schedule, she wouldn't be able to juggle work and studies, so she would have to either endure it or wait until she had enough money for the course and for the initial period afterward. When she arrived at work, the boss called her in. At that moment, Adriana already knew that this situation would not end well for her. "All right, Adriana, I've thought it over and decided that you and I need to sleep together. Once we do that, I'll leave you alone. I'll give you a good work position in our cafeteria, you'll calmly distribute food, earn twice as much, and no one will bother you anymore," the boss said calmly. Adriana was simply stunned by such an offer. She looked at the middle-aged man, whose gray hair covered not only his still unshaven temples but also his thin beard and equally thin mustache. The thought of having to sleep with this man made her sick. Adriana grimaced, barely able to say a word before he reacted rather sharply to her expression. "Why are you grimacing like that? Do you think other men will want to do it after your imprisonment? No respectable man would ever sleep with someone like you," he retorted. "Then you don't respect yourself," Adriana said. "What are you babbling about? I'm actually doing you a favor if you haven't realized yet. You know what, girl? You'll be washing the homeless from now on. Got it? It's too luxurious of a job for you to mop floors and take out trash. Now get out of here. I don't even want to see you in other departments of the hospital," the boss yelled. Her facial expressions and reaction to his proposition clearly enraged the chief physician, who probably expected a huge desire from her side. Adriana descended to where she was now supposed to work. Now she had to wash the homeless people. Adriana didn't particularly complain. The smell and the awful stench didn't bother her much. For the most part, they were quite kind and reasonable people who tried to minimize her involvement in such an intimate process. There were some mentally disabled, quite sharp and aggressive ones. But such people were a rarity. The boss now avoided her altogether, as if she had become a leper after such a sharp reaction. Once, Adriana was doing her job, chatting with an old man who chuckled after the cleaning. He smiled slightly and thanked her for the opportunity they had. He offered her some measly coins, but naturally, she didn't take them. Those coins were much more necessary and important to him than to her. But suddenly, they wheeled in a stretcher, and there was a young man with a broken arm on it. And when Adriana looked at him, she simply couldn't utter a word. It was the same Valerio Castro, the young boss, who had hit on her and with whom they had argued. It was the man because of whom she was imprisoned as an accomplice. But she couldn't be 100% sure. However, when Adriana finished all the hygienic procedures, her confidence grew. "What's your name?" "To be honest, I don't remember anything. The locals named me Rodrigo, so I stuck with it. Although, honestly, I don't remember my real name. I don't remember much at all. Only the last couple of years, right?" she asked, and he immediately tensed up, staring at her. "How did you figure that out?" "I think I recognize you. But I might be wrong." "I don't want you to harbor false hopes," she said, shaking her head negatively. But she already saw how his eyes lit up, a glimmer of hope emerging that someone still remembered him. "Do you know my family? Do I have relatives? If you are the person I think you are, then yes, you have a close person. I'll try to get in touch with them. You see, all of this is strange. If you are the person I'm talking about. You disappeared a few years ago, and because of you, I ended up in prison." The man was simply stunned. He looked closely at the stranger, who spoke softly, smoothly, as if afraid to blurt out too much. "So what does that mean? Am I some kind of bad person? Maybe that's why I lost my memory. Although..." Suddenly, he stared at her, carefully examining every inch of her face. It seemed to her that he was starting to remember her. It often happens that people who have lost their memory begin to remember everything when they see familiar places or people from their foggy past. "What do you remember, anyway?" "I remember lying on the rocks. I remember my legs getting numb from the icy water. I tried to get up, but I couldn't do anything. My hands were weak, and nausea kept rising in my throat. I was standing like that, and then I collapsed on the rocks and blacked out for a while. And then they found me. The fishermen say I was lying by the mountain river. Maybe it's true. Who knows? He fell silent for a while, then looked at the stranger and again stared at her face, as if hoping to notice some scar, scratch, or mole that would give him a chance to remember everything. I lived with the fishermen for a while, and then I went to the city. Here, I started living as a homeless person. What else could I do? I have no documents, I don't remember my past, nothing at all. It's like I'm cursed with amnesia. Adriana was listening to him attentively, quickly jotting something down as soon as she left the ward. She had to go to his uncle and tell him everything, because that's the only way the man would have a chance to return to a normal life, and she would have the opportunity to restore justice. Adriana called her old friend from her previous workplace because she really wanted to know how things were going there. She understood that she couldn't return to her previous job, no matter what. But now the purpose of her communication was different. Nora met her eagerly, looking completely tired, worn out, and exhausted. Since that incident with you, many things have changed. Remember Lucretia, the chief's wife? Now she's the one in charge there. The young wife has annoyed everyone so much that it's unbearable. And Basilio himself has completely withered away since his nephew disappeared, locked himself in his country house, hardly ever goes out, and doesn't see any point in life. Our company is about to go bankrupt soon if everything continues this way. Wasn't anyone else hired for the position of manager besides her? There were plenty of opportunities to hire someone else, but this girl is not going to give up her hard-earned position to anyone. She's asserting herself at our expense and fancies herself a great leader. Do you think she'll voluntarily give up such a privilege? No way. Such people never refuse the opportunity to ridicule others. Nora just rolled her eyes. She had no energy left for a conversation. I've worked there for so many years. I thought I would grow within the company, but now I'm sending out resumes because I can't stand it anymore. This overbearing girl sees absolutely nothing around her. She thinks we aren't going to quit, so she can mistreat us. But I'll tell you a secret, half of the office has already updated their resumes on the website, Nora said. Adriana understood the situation unfolding in the office. She already knew that there was no escaping from it. Her gut told her that everything was happening for a reason. The next day, taking advantage of her day off, Adriana went to the former boss's house. Basilio Gil refused to come out of the house. The security guards practically tried to push her away, but Adriana didn't give up. She gave them a photograph, taken beforehand at the hospital. Adriana was waiting for the picture to be passed on to the man. But when he appeared at the gates, he seemed irritated. Is this a joke? You decided to mock a grieving uncle? Are you going to start faking photos now? What do you want, money? He asked. And then Basilio froze. He finally recognized the girl standing before him. But upon realizing this, he grimaced even more, clearly not thrilled that she had come. You? What the hell is going on here? I recently got out of prison, and I still maintain that I was innocent. After prison, I couldn't get a job anywhere, you understand that perfectly well. So, I got a job as a nurse at the local hospital. They bring homeless people to us, and this guy is there too. He doesn't remember anything, he's looking around, asking if he has any relatives. He only remembers his last few years. Doesn't that seem strange to you? What nonsense are you talking about? I'm not going to listen to this anymore. She wanted to shout something to make him stop, even for a moment. But he left, leaving her alone with an endless stream of thoughts. Adriana went home, losing all hope of helping the boy, who might, after all, be a completely different person. There are so many people who look similar in the world, right? Perhaps he was just a spitting image of her acquaintance. This thought made her sad, as if her insides were turning upside down. Adriana wanted to regain her old life and, if there was a possibility, return to the branch and refuse further staff rotations at the expense of her own career. It was better to suffer such career damage than to end up in prison and ruin her entire life without a chance at any normal job now. Early in the morning, Adriana began to get ready for work. Every day, when she had to go to the hospital, seemed endlessly long, heavy, and unbearable. The boss seemed to have completely lost control. He constantly offered her disgusting things. And when she refused, he overloaded her with work, like Cinderella from a fairy tale. Adriana arrived at the hospital without much enthusiasm. But as soon as she entered, she found herself in the midst of events. Everyone's running around. Even the chief physician was rushing around like crazy, ruffling his thinning hair. "Adriana, what have you done, you idiot?" Pablo rushed up to her and grabbed her by the collar, wanting to hit her. But he didn't manage to finish what he started because the glass doors of the hospital opened. Basilio, who had come here for the second time, was furious with the local big shot. He grabbed Pablo, dragging him across the floor straight to the ward where his nephew was. Adriana, who had almost suffered for her boldness, was standing with her legs trembling. The senior nurse immediately rushed to her, helping her to come to her senses and repeatedly saying that she urgently needed to quit such a job. It turned out that Basilio did come to the hospital after she handed him the photograph. Upon recognizing his son and the young man, he went to find the chief physician, who had laid the boy on the ground, thinking that the bed would be needed for someone else. Can you imagine? The guy you were talking to turned out to be Basilio's son or nephew. I still don't understand. Anyway, he's related to Basilio. Can you believe it? He'll kill our chief physician after he finds out what's going on here, for sure. Thank you, Adriana. I don't know how, but you did something crucial when he came here. Our chief physician nearly killed you for nothing. Now he'll be fired, and we'll have a normal job. I owe you my life, Adriana. The senior nurse repeated this, dressing the still frightened girl in a gown. It didn't take long before Basilio, still dragging the chief physician across the floor, appeared. He threw him right in front of Adriana and forced him to apologize on his knees. She was astonished and staring at the man who had tormented her for so long and who now, finally, would get what he deserved. The chief physician got down on his knees, apologized to her, tears streaming down his face, and glared angrily at the nurses who were triumphantly watching his humiliation. And now you can pack your things, soon you won't work here anymore. Look at what kind of monster they've put in charge. The businessman cut in rudely, then took Adriana's hand. This is him. Can you imagine? This is actually my boy. I can't believe it. We'll take him to a good hospital now. If necessary, I'll take him abroad. I'll see you again, I owe you. Adriana just looked at him with astonished eyes and nodded. She was glad that they would take the young man to a good hospital. But the question of how he ended up in such a situation still haunted her. Moreover, Adriana suspected that her life difficulties were directly related to how Valerio ended up in that horrible, icy river and survived. Adriana was fired on the same day, as soon as the businessman left. Apparently, as a final act, the chief physician decided to spite her thoroughly. But she was ready to quit herself. All the nurses practically bowed, thanking her. Doctors came out and repeated that she must have definitely come back when they appointed a new chief physician. As soon as Adriana left the hospital, the regional health authority representative arrived. He was all sweaty, furious, and ready to tear everything apart. As far as Adriana knew, the former chief physician had been fired within hours of her dismissal. She was sitting in her apartment, feeling nothing but profound disappointment. She realized that she had helped the hospital but not herself. As always, everyone benefited from her actions except her. Adriana was sitting on the couch when her friend called, and she told her everything. Isabel, who was terribly shocked by what had happened, couldn't stop apologizing. She felt guilty for her friend enduring such terrible humiliations all this time without confiding in her. And yet, Isabel herself had recommended her for that job, having no idea of the chaos that was going on there. Adriana was now unemployed again, but she didn't want to return to her previous position. She'd been searching for various odd jobs and had found the remote work, spending hours on the line, answering calls. Everything became more or less bearable again. Adriana caught herself waiting for calls for hours. She hoped that her former boss would call and that Valerio himself would call and tell her that he remembered everything. Was she still hoping for some kind of reward for herself? Most of all, Adriana worried that the young man wouldn't remember anything. After all, he had a loving uncle who had a lot of money and wouldn't let him disappear into the abyss of injustice. Adriana woke up at 4 in the morning. She was lying in bed, unable to fall asleep. She was making up various scenarios in her head about how her life could have turned out. It was silly to dwell on what could be returned and restored. She stared at the ceiling, thinking about how much she had missed in her life and now would never be able to catch up on. Maybe she would have received another education and gotten a job at a bigger firm. Or simply been grateful for having her own little life in an apartment where no one hurt her, humiliated her, or reproached her for not having children. Adriana got up and brewed herself some coffee. She was immersed in thoughts of constant anxiety. Perhaps it was time to let go of all this? Perhaps it was time to forget the whole nightmare that had happened in her life? To learn to live on, find a more or less normal job. She had to learn not to dwell on the bad and not live in moments from the past when she could have turned everything to her advantage. Adriana took a small tray of cookies, then turned on the television. Today it became known that the scandal has taken a new turn. As it is known, Basilio Gil, a local businessman, oligarch, and big benefactor to the city, has found his nephew, who was previously considered missing. Currently, law enforcement authorities have initiated new investigations into the case. I remind you that a few years ago, his girlfriend was imprisoned on charges of complicity with the missing young man. It's interesting to see how the situation will unfold now, considering that several years of the unfortunate girl's life have already been taken away. I'm Marcela Blanco. See you soon. Adriana barely managed to hold onto her cup. She put a cookie in her mouth and stared into space, still not understanding what was happening. She looked as if she were looking right through, not seeing or noticing anything around her. The constant oppressive feeling in her chest made her want to breathe deeper, to gasp for air with her mouth, as if it could help her focus and not sink into a panic attack. Could it be that they were initiating the case again? Could all the charges be dropped and she could return to a normal life? From this hope, which faintly flickered somewhere deep in her soul, Adriana burst into loud sobs, unable to contain herself anymore, and didn't even try. Adriana cried heavily until all her tears dried up. For the first time since she was released from prison, she was finally able to cry properly. It felt significantly lighter. Maybe all these humiliations in the hospital, the endless threats, the dreadful years in prison, all of it was not in vain, and she could return. Adriana mentally persuaded herself not to cling to the elusive hope. But now, hope was the only thing that could give her life meaning. So, today we are returning for the third time to the situation unfolding in the southern city. Currently, as far as we know, law enforcement authorities have arrested Lucretia Gill. The young wife of the oligarch may be involved in the disappearance of the young man. Law enforcement authorities are not providing us with any information at the moment, but we have our verified sources, the woman said. Her face had already appeared on the television screen more than once today. Adriana immediately tensed, straightened up, and moved closer to the television, afraid of missing something important. Would you share some news from your sources? The host asked awkwardly, realizing his mistake but choosing not to correct it. There is currently a full-scale investigation underway, and it's quite likely that the girl was unlawfully imprisoned. After all, I remind you, there was no evidence against her. However, the poor girl still ended up behind bars. If it turns out now that the situation is different, I will be curious to see how our city's leader will be held accountable for the actions of those entrusted to him. Also, I remind you that we have repeatedly filed a petition, which was supposed to be considered, and an innocent person had to be released as there was no evidence. Something tells me that these changes will lead to a change in the city's leadership as a whole. The woman spoke with a self-satisfied smile. She looked good on camera, and it was immediately apparent that she was deliberately speaking more on one side to position herself slightly askew. Surely, she couldn't care less about Adriana as such. But no one will prevent her from looking good on camera. The girl, who was now following the progress of the investigation, already knew in advance that very soon not only the reports on this topic would stop airing, but also on social media, they would begin to silence the entire situation. Last time it was exactly the same. When she was arrested, all the news covering the issue instantly began to disappear one by one, as if nothing was happening at all. Adriana jumped in place when she heard the doorbell ring. The sudden sound made her heart beat so fast that it seemed it would jump out of her chest at any moment. She got up and quickly went out into the hallway. But when she opened the door and saw Basilio Gil there, she didn't even know whether to be happy or afraid. "Can I come in for a few minutes, literally?" he asked, carefully restraining his businesslike tone. Adriana had no idea what he needed, but she also didn't try to stop him. The man entered the apartment without even looking around. He only took a few steps from the door so that the neighbors couldn't eavesdrop on their conversation. "I can't disclose all the details of the investigation to you right now, but it's already clear that you were not involved. I myself was not thrilled when they imprisoned you without any evidence. Besides, you were sure that my nephew was innocent. I'm grateful to you and want to compensate for everything. What do you want?" "I want to get expensive courses to learn and then get a job," the girl replied automatically, forgetting about her modesty, which she always relied on. He nodded. She escorted him deeper into the apartment. He immediately provided his card details, paid for everything, and then left her a huge sum on the card. He said it would be enough for the first time while she was studying. Adriana was so surprised that she couldn't even respond properly. The man was immersed in sadness. It was hard for him to talk. He looked at her, smiled slightly, and felt like a fool. After all, he had the money. He could have helped her back then, but he didn't think it was necessary, assuming that in prison she would finally confess where his nephew was. Even he, a close relative, was ready to believe that his nephew was still guilty and needed to be found before the company completely collapsed. But Basilio couldn't even imagine, in his worst nightmare, that the woman who loved him could set up such a terrible trap in his own office. Several months later, Adriana could already take on her first orders, although she continued her studies. She tried to spend as little time away from home as possible, took on more practical tasks, and was confident that this would help her become a master in her profession. But suddenly, an expensive car stopped in front of the house. And when Adriana saw Valerio waving at her from the window, she immediately rushed outside. She hugged him and kissed both his cheeks, congratulating him on his return. It was evident that the young man remembered everything. His face literally glowed with happiness that he had survived this nightmare and returned to his former life. He hugged her around the waist and kissed her tightly, and from that moment on, their relationship ceased to be just friendly. Heavy legal proceedings began. The disputes were occasionally covered on television, but no one revealed any details. The uncle, returning to normal life, once again felt like a man of action. He returned to the company and resumed his duties there. Again, he entrusted most of the business to his nephew. Valerio quickly returned to his previous rhythm of life and never complained of fatigue. He vividly remembered what it was like to live without family or a homeland after being completely alone on the streets and experiencing various difficult life situations. "So, what happened?" Adriana asked when she was alone with her beloved. By that time, the final trial had taken place, and the verdict was handed down, which became a huge sign. After all, it touched upon, among other things, law enforcement officers and higher authorities who had been concealing this situation. Adriana finally had her sentence overturned. She even received compensation, although no amount of money could possibly offset the nightmare she had endured. My uncle's wife decided that she needed more excitement in life. The money he gave her wasn't enough. She wanted to start her own business, but Uncle wasn't thrilled about it. He knew she would spend all the money and achieve nothing. Eventually, she and her lover decided they would have a sweet life at his expense. "And what does this have to do with you?" Adriana asked. "That's the most interesting part, darling," the young man said. "They figured it would be much easier to reach him through me. I have to admit, their plan worked. They invited me to go to the countryside, and before I knew it, a scuffle broke out. They hit me on the head, stuffed me into a bag, and threw me off a cliff into a mountain river. We went back to that cliff several times with the investigator. I still can't believe I survived such a monstrous fall," he said. Valerio settled into the chair more comfortably, placing his girlfriend on his lap. She rested her head on his chest. They felt much happier and calmer when they were together. By my estimate, I floated down that river in the bag for several kilometers. I can't believe I made it to shore, let alone alive. It turned out I had severe hypothermia, rib fractures, and God knows what else. But I survived, and I even had the opportunity to return to the city. I can't believe they were so careless about it all. If they had tracked me or even finished me off before stuffing me into the bag, it would have been much simpler," he shrugged. Adriana didn't interrupt him. She never asked him about it, so she tried to keep the pauses to find out the whole story at last. After all, she was also a part of this story and had received no fewer blows from life than her beloved. When I was gone, they staged a whole drama at home about mourning and tragedy. She constantly hinted that I was no longer alive. And my uncle gradually sank deeper into the depths of despair. You were imprisoned, and it seemed like the situation had stabilized. They continued to carry out their machinations, but then I showed up, and everything didn't go according to plan. Now, considering all they've done even after this situation, they'll have to spend 20 years in prison. I'm glad these people are finally in prison, far away from us, our lives, and the opportunity to simply live and work without worrying about possible traitors. Did your uncle take it so hard that she turned out to be such a person? Yes, when he learned the truth, he immediately reported it to the police, although it was a heavy blow for him. I look at him and understand that he literally gave up his happy life with his young wife just to get me out and, at the same time, clear your name, he said. Basilio Gil quickly recovered from the betrayal and entered into new relationships within 6 months, not particularly concerned about how his former partner was spending her time in prison. He focused on his business, planned to open several branches across the country, and tried not to dwell on the nightmare he had endured. Adriana and Valerio got married 6 months after his return. They sincerely loved each other and were grateful that they now had a chance to live, despite their unbearably difficult past. And just 2 years after their wedding, they welcomed a wonderful little boy into the world, who became a delight for his parents, a marvelous grandson for Uncle Valerio, and a miracle for Adriana, who had already given up hope of becoming a mother.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.